In order to best understand whether or not zero tolerance policies are helpful, the history of the policies, their use in the U.S. school system, and their effectiveness must be discussed. Recommendations for the future will also be parsed out. There is always room for improvement with any policy, and zero tolerance is no exception. Zero tolerance policies began to be enforced in public schools in the early 1990s and were originally designed to aid in prosecuting drug offenders. In the 1980s, the federal government adopted these policies as a way of deterring criminal behavior by declaring certain crimes intolerable. In 1986, San Diego U.S. Attorney Peter Nunez created a program which impounded any vessel that was found to have illegal drugs aboard. 2 years later, in 1988, the program received a federal accolade by U.S. Attorney General Edwin Meese. Meese issued orders to custom officials requiring the seizure of property of any individual found with drugs. No matter the amount, these individuals were then charged at the federal level. 1989 saw the adoption of these zero tolerance policies in California, New York, and Kentucky school districts. And by 1993, school districts across the country had instituted zero tolerance policies concerning drugs and weapons. School districts also began to implement zero tolerance policies concerning smoking and class disruption. Legislative acts have also enacted zero tolerance policies. In 1994, Bill Clinton signed the Gun-Free School Act. The law mandates a 1-year calendar expulsion for possession of a firearm, referral of law-violating students to the criminal or juvenile justice system, and the provision that the state law must authorize the chief administrative officer of each local school district to modify such expulsions on a case-by-case basis. Amendments to the Act add that any item can conceivably be used as a weapon. In the average U.S. school district, zero tolerance policies require predetermined consequences or punishments for certain offenses. Examples include suspensions for drug offenses, attendance issues, disrespect, and non-compliance. According to the National Center for Educational Statistics, 94% of U.S. schools have zero tolerance policies for weapons or firearms, and 87% for alcohol, while 79% report mandatory suspensions or expulsions for violence or tobacco. These policies combat crime in schools by making the consequences punitive in nature. Heavy mandatory punishments are designed to deter students from engaging in criminal activities. In 2012, students ages 12 to 18 were victims of about 1,364,900 non-fatal victimizations at school, including 615,600 thefts and 749,200 violent victimizations, 89,000 of which were serious violent victimizations. Schools face a very real threat that not only place students in danger, but distract from the overall purpose of schooling itself, to provide an education in a safe and disruption-free environment. There is no shortage of opinions when it comes to the use of zero tolerance policies. One search on the internet generates a plethora of articles that mostly have negative things to say about zero tolerance, whether that it harms minorities, causes schools to resemble prisons, creates a hostile environment for boys, or failing to make schools safer, Most outside commentators agree that the policies must be abandoned. Like WAVY in Norfolk, Virginia, also have reported on some of the more radical applications of zero-tolerance policies.
A Virginia Beach sixth grader was back in class today after spending the rest of that week on suspension.
Many of you have been following Adriana's story. The principal suspended her after she took a blade from a classmate. She told her guidance counselor he was cutting himself, and it seemed like the right thing to do. In the end, school leaders agreed she did the right thing, but why did it take so long to make that decision? 10 on Your Side's Andy Fox has been looking into no-tolerance policies and whether the school board should make changes. Andy, what'd you find out?
Yeah, there's a lot of people calling for changes to the policy. They just simply think that it is inflexible. Critics argue zero tolerance has become too inflexible. Matter of fact, Adriana Harris and her mother both say after she was suspended last Friday, they got the feeling Bayside Middle School principal Paula Johnson acted like there was nothing she could do, that her hands were tied. When we sat down with Adriana Harris and her mother Rachel, they told us the story of a zero-tolerance policy that eliminates human consideration.
Take it up at the hearing with the school board. That's out of her hands. Everything they told me was policy, policy, policy.
Virginia Beach's zero-tolerance policy reads, a student in possession of any weapon, which a razor can be, shall automatically be recommended for long-term suspension or expulsion. Automatically.
My opinion would be that zero tolerance takes common sense out of the equation.
Attorney Kevin Martingale concerned automatic triggers.
To some extent, it appears that some of the school board policies tie the hands of the principals, and I would think it would be appropriate for the school board to go back, revisit those, and take out any automatic trigger language, and let the principals make decisions on a case-by-case basis.
The Harrises say Adriana never should have been suspended, that there was a good reason why she had a razor on Bayside Middle School property, that she took the small razor that looks like this out of the hands of a friend who was cutting his arm before she immediately threw the razor away. Martingale says this isn't what we mean when we talk about zero tolerance. And what is clear tonight is that the Virginia Beach School Board, made up of 11 members who refused to return our calls or had no comment, they are the ones alone who can change the zero-tolerance policy culture that critics argue led to what happened to Adriana Harris.
So the school board can decide how much discretion they want to give the local decision makers. Local decision makers are the principals because each principal is in charge of his or her school building.
Now, had Virginia Beach Schools made the decision last Friday to keep Adriana in class instead of suspending her and acknowledging that she was possibly saving her friend's life, then Adriana would have been spared her week-long night, and Virginia Beach Schools would have been spared the embarrassment they suffered in the court of public opinion. In the newsroom, Andy Fox, 10 on Your Side.
Does empirical research support these claims that zero-tolerance policies are harming America's students? Do zero-tolerance policies keep schools safe? The American Psychological Association aimed to answer these questions in their 2008 study, Are Zero-Tolerance Programs Effective in the Schools? This study reviews the evidence and gives recommendations for the future. This study addresses 6 main questions concerning zero-tolerance policies, the first of which is, are schools safer and better equipped to handle discipline problems? The APA concluded that there are 5 main assumptions made about the necessity of zero-tolerance policies. These assumptions are that school violence is increasing, requiring forceful prevention strategies, that zero tolerance equalizes and clarifies punishments for all students. Suspending disruptive students creates an environment conducive to learning for other students. Mandatory punishments deter students from committing offenses, and that parents commend zero tolerance policies. The evidence called through the APA's research tended to contradict these assumptions. Concerning school violence, the evidence actually points to a decrease in violence since 1985, and deadly violence in schools remains a relatively small proportion of school disruptions. The second assumption is that zero-tolerance policies equalize and clarify punishments for students. However, school policies vary widely across the United States, as do suspension and expulsion rates. This variation appears to be due as much to characteristics of schools and school personnel, like disciplinary philosophies and quality of school governance, as the behavior and attitudes of students. The third assumption, that removing disruptive students creates a better learning environment, has also been proven false. According to the APA, schools with higher rates of suspension experience a less satisfactory rating of school climate. These schools are more likely to have poor school governing structures and spend an inordinate amount of time on school discipline issues. The fourth assumption is that mandatory punishments deter students from acting out in the future. In reality, students who are suspended are more likely to engage in inappropriate behaviors after their suspensions. Students who are suspended are also more likely to drop out or are unable to graduate on time. The fifth assumption is that most parents support zero-tolerance policies. The APA found the data to be mixed in this instance. When school safety was the issue, parents rallied around zero-tolerance policies. However, when it appeared that students' rights to an education were being threatened, parents had a negative reaction to the policies. Most students also find these policies to be harsh and unfair. Concerning minority students and students with disabilities, zero-tolerance policies have an embedded aim to remove outside factors when it comes to handling discipline cases. The goal is to create a fair environment in which minority students are not given the majority of punishments. However, zero-tolerance policies tend to do nothing to prevent minority students, especially African American students, from receiving an overwhelming number of suspensions and expulsions when compared to the white student population. The data suggests that when it comes to corporal punishment, out-of-school suspensions and expulsions, minority students are more likely to face such punishments. For example, Black students are 2.84 times more likely to face out-of-school suspension and 2.7 times more likely to face expulsion than white students. Researchers agree that there is no propensity towards violence among minority students. Neither does economic disadvantage show causation in the data. Instead, a lack of preparation and ineptitude in classroom management, a lack of training in culturally competent practices, and racial stereotypes are some of the main causes of the overrepresentation of minority students when it comes to discipline. Information on students with disabilities is not as widely available, but it has been found that students with disabilities, especially students with emotional or behavioral disorders, are more likely to face suspension and expulsion than students without disabilities. The next question needing consideration is whether or not zero-tolerance policies are developmentally appropriate. It's a well-known fact that children's brains are in development and do not reach full maturity until their mid-20s. This brain immaturity appears to cause psychological maturity in at least 4 different areas. They include poor resistance to peer influence, attitudes towards perception of risk, future orientation, and impulse control. These psychological immaturities will inevitably lead adolescents to engage in inappropriate behavior. While the APA recognizes the responsibility for these behaviors lies with the student, zero-tolerance policies can often be misused and harm the student's development when no actual harm has occurred because of the behavior. Instead of approaching a student's behavior with a one-size-fits-all consequence, it would perhaps be more prudent to look at whether or not the consequence will developmentally harm the student. How do zero-tolerance policies relate to the juvenile justice system is also an important question. As zero-tolerance policies have been introduced, schools have increasingly begun to rely on security technology, security personnel, and profiling. This is especially prevalent in school communities with large minority populations and high poverty. In this ABC News program 2020 shows that schools are increasingly turning to law enforcement to deal with discipline problems.
Imagine going into the post office and seeing these crimes on those 10 most wanted flyers, classroom edition. Burping, doodling, throwing a tantrum. Bad behavior to be sure, but worthy of arrest at 5 years old? Everything I listed are crimes that got kids handcuffed by police. Of course, we want law and order in our classrooms, but at what cost? Bad things can happen at school. Guns, drugs, bullying. And as you can see in all those videos on the internet, classrooms run amok. Shut up and sit down. So it is for good reason that more and more police are on the beat in hallways and classrooms across the country. But in this climate of controlling behavior, have we gone too far? Case in point, the Texas girl's in the news right now for getting spanked.
After she got caught helping another student cheat, Taylor got a paddle to the backside.
Too hard, their mothers say, by a male vice principal.
Giving her a swat behind closed doors? That is creepy.
Yep, spanking, still legal in schools in 19 states. The 9-year-old in Gastonia, North Carolina, suspended for sexual harassment because, get this, he was overheard telling a friend,
I said Miss Taylor was cute.
his teacher was cute. The school later apologized and forced the principal to retire. And this video stunned the nation in 2005. Remember the 5-year-old girl handcuffed by St. Petersburg, Florida police for throwing a tantrum in preschool? How can this be? Advocates say the combination of cops and kids in the classroom is having all kinds of unintended consequences. Some of them so ridiculous, you literally can't make this stuff up.
Your daughter's school decided to have her arrested?
When she was just 12 years old, Alexa was arrested in her New York City middle school, searched, handcuffed, taken away by 4 of New York's finest.
Had you ever been in a police station?
No.
Had you ever been arrested?
No.
Alexa is now 15, but remembers her crime like it was yesterday. Doodling on a desk. With an erasable marker, no less.
So you wrote on the desk. It's not like pulling a knife on somebody, but you're not supposed to write on the desk, true?
Yes.
Are you a graffiti artist?
No.
Did you used to spray paint right all over the walls in school?
Never.
Were you known as that?
No.
Alexa, like some funny tag name that you had that you used?
No.
Alexa had the very bad luck to be attending a school with a zero tolerance for graffiti. And, as her mother would tell you, a similar score in common sense.
Unfortunately, there are few positives of zero-tolerance policies, according to experts and evidence. In some cases, removing a person from school grounds and banning their return for a predetermined period of time can keep students safe. But in cases where students bring weapons or drugs to school, make serious threats, commit assault, or other serious crimes, zero-tolerance policies do serve to protect students. Where zero-tolerance policies are lacking, however, there are opportunities for improvement. Zero tolerance policies can be reformed by allowing for greater discretion as to what offenses should be handled in school and what offenses require the assistance of law enforcement officers or suspensions and expulsions. Administrators should be in dialogue with teachers to categorize and define violations of school policies. Teachers will then be able to incorporate responses to these infractions within their classroom management plans. A focus should also be on de-escalating volatile behaviors. The use of suspensions and expulsions should be used only in the event of a serious infraction resulting in safety concerns for staff and students. A tiered discipline strategy should also be employed. According to the APA, schools also need to look into investigating a threefold violence prevention strategy, working at the root of the violence problem instead of just dealing with the aftermath by calling the police. Primarily, these programs will target all students, like school-wide bullying prevention programs. Secondarily, threat assessment allows administrators to discover students who are at risk for violent behaviors. The tertiary step for students who have engaged in violent disruption is restorative justice, which encourages rehabilitation. In conclusion, zero tolerance policies are well meant, but are not the most effective or helpful way to discipline students. Evidence suggests that zero tolerance policies do not improve school climate or school safety.